Our perception of money is changing rapidly, and banks are at the center of all of it. From how we access it, to how we buy, to how we trust that that money will be there when we need it. I'm Kiah Haslett, the creator of FinTech Takes Banking. Here on Bank Nerd Corner, I talk with bankers, economists, academics, and more about the complex dynamics shaping the financial services landscape. This week on Bank Nerd Corner, I'm bringing you another conversation I had while attending CBA Live 2026 in San Diego. The Consumer Bankers Association hosted nearly 1,800 bankers, policymakers, and industry leaders at this year's event. While I was there, I spoke with Brian Fritzsche, CBA's Associate General Counsel, who leads the group's advocacy efforts on payments fraud. We talk about why CBA wants a safe harbor for fraud data sharing, how checks are still a fraud vector in 2026, and what could happen if nothing changes in the next 12 months. Hi, Brian. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I think fraud has been an omnipresent problem for banks. And one thing that used to make me laugh as at my old job, we would do surveys, and sometimes fraud would be in the tech survey, and sometimes fraud would be in the risk survey, because it felt like it was such a diffuse issue and just being addressed in different ways. And I know that CBA has been doing a lot of work kind of in the advocacy and policy side to really emphasize how big of a problem this is for financial institutions, for consumers, and it requires a lot of coordination. And that's what I'm excited to talk to you about today. So how do you describe the, quote, fraud and scam problem for banks?
Sure. And once again, thanks for having me. Fraud and scams are related but distinct issues. And I think that really, as kind of a threshold matter, it's important to separate those two. While we gain a lot of our knowledge from CBA's Fraud Management Committee, in an ideal world, I'd love for it to be the Fraud and Scams Committee.
Sure.
And so the distinguishing feature matters because it informs the solutions for dealing with each. So with fraud, the deception is occurring at the bank. That is, a criminal is moving your money and you did not authorize it. So it's someone gaining access to your account, taking it over, sending those funds out. Scams, on the other hand, is when the consumer is the one hitting push and sending the money, but the actual deception, the actual crime is occurring somewhere else. So think it's the classic Keanu Reeves is in love with you and needs to send him money so he could get out of the country.
Sure.
The actual deception is occurring, maybe on a social media platform, maybe via text, but the bank, the entity that moves the money, doesn't have insight into that. And I really like to start off with that distinction because, if a crime's occurring to very different places, they have two very different solutions for dealing with them.
I think the thing they share in common is the perpetrator, right? The thief, and then the goal is the money. And so the question is who needs to be tricked, and who does this person need to trick in order to get the thing that they need? And obviously, there's different techniques they'd use, and I think when the bank is tricked versus when the consumer is tricked, those are kind of experienced differently. But it is kind of, it's just for me sometimes to be like, it's a target, and they're going to kind of hit both, and they're going to see which one is the weaker of the two, right?
Yes. And, I like how you characterize it, customer tricked or bank tricked, because I think it goes to a lot of the discourse about what to do then after this happens, right? Like with fraud, the bank's tricked. That makes sense that that's something that the bank might have to step up and deal with. Something like that happens. And a lot of the tools that CPA member banks use are really good at trying to deal with that problem of confirming who is this, like what are we doing between like identity verification, two-factor authentication, all that stuff is meant to solve that problem. But really the bank can only do so much when it's the scam example where the person saying, I have Keanu Reeves on the line, like they could introduce some friction and say, hey, like pause, think about this if you can. But at the end of the day, it's their money. And I don't think you really want banks in the business of starting to tell consumers when they can and can't send their funds. But so I think that's why banks can do some there, but other platforms like social media or telecom are where a lot of the effort needs to be to deal with the scam problem.
Oh yeah. So I think we've talked about this as if it's A, then B, then C, and then the money, but it's not. It's a lot of this stuff happens digitally, and so the ecosystem around how the scam or fraud happens involves other players. So tell me a little bit about CBA's policy and advocacy work when it comes to, I don't know if you delineate between fraud and scams. And then what are the stakes for banks? Like, why is this something that CBA feels is important to surface for membership and then also for, outside of the members?
Sure. And so I'll give a little bit of the background that CBA has a handful of subject area committees where our member banks have a representative on them.
Okay.
Broad topic areas. So like what that's about the CPB or default, we have one for fraud. And so when we advocate, we are pulling insights from our active members who are on the front lines dealing with this day in and day out. One of the clearest things that they say is banks are not in the business of having their customers lose money, because then like that really harms their relationship with their customer. And it also, it's a much bigger global problem when you think about the entities that are doing this fraud and scam activity. It's not, one like sketchy roofing company that lied about something. It is, transnational organizations, criminal organizations, foreign state actors. The money is, the loss of money is bad, but it's also knowing that the money is then being used for very bad things after that.
Yeah.
And so banks are very invested, both from the customer relationship perspective as well as the good of the earth perspective on this point.
Right.
In terms of CBA's advocacy, we've been on a journey for the last, let's say, 2 years or so. So we commissioned a white paper and then hosted a roundtable I had. Our members, the other stakeholders from telecommunications industry, government, et cetera, to kind of at least map out, like everyone's saying this is a problem, but you really need to know the landscape of the mountain and what the boulders are before you start moving boulders.
Right.
So from there, that really informed a lot of the work that CBA has advocated for, and which you've seen institutions like the Aspen Institute take up this call for a public-private, cross-sector, whole-of-government approach.
Okay.
And I know that sounds like a lot of word salad. So many words, but it's not just buzzwords. They're kind of key principles. Public-private. The government has a role to play, but also private industries, banks, telecommunications, social media also have a role to play.
Yeah.
Cross-sector. This isn't, from the fraud and scam standpoint, it's not a banking problem.
Yeah.
It's not just a telecommunications problem. The fraud and scam activity occurs across so many vectors that one sector working on it isn't going to solve the overall issue. And whole of government, this is something that, to push the leading the charge should be the government, because they can play a great coordinating function.
Right.
Government has, law enforcement capabilities, which would be helpful for dealing with this. They have regulatory abilities, make things easier to fight fraud and scams. So that's why we've really pushed for that perspective. And that's informed a lot of positions that CBA has taken, advocacy we've done with our friends of Congress on various bills to deal with fraud and scams. But I think it's helpful that the conversation a few years ago was, how bad are fraud and scams? Now the conversation is, we know this is bad.
Yeah.
How are we going to deal with this?
Yeah. And I think, no one listening to this will be surprised that the fraud and scam losses have gotten bad. But sometimes I'm always surprised, like, just how bad, how much money are people losing?
And when you think about it, that's what's reported. Can you imagine
it's not the full
the
money
stigma
loss
that comes around with it as well? It's even worse than we can imagine.
Yeah. And I'm always, this is not my best impulse, but those DMV scam text messages?
I got one when I was here today, like earlier. It says you have an unpaid toll in Jersey.
I'm always a little impressed by the work and commitment these scammers will do to learn about American culture. And that the day someone stumbled onto this DMV thing, they were like, do you know what a DMV is? And they're like, no, I don't know what that is. And they're like, so in America, there's a DMV thing and people have to pay it. And I think if we impersonate the DMV and texted a bunch of people with a very official looking text, people will just pay it. And the site we can make a site that looks very easy. And I'm always impressed by the commitment.
But the technology advances, it's also just getting easier too.
Sure.
10 years ago, you would have seen site would have the classic misspellings, weird capitalizations. But now with the use of artificial intelligence and resources, it looks very legitimate.
Yes.
My wife and I recently just bought a house. At every stage, there are all these disclaimers, and it's like who you're sending money to, and I had to tunnel check everything, just be like, is this real? Okay, like I want to make sure that things are real.
Yeah. I'm glad it sounds like you paid the correct people successfully and you didn't have your money stolen by an intermediary scam. It's like,
Knock on wood, but yes.
So, we're talking in these both examples, we've kind of talked about, again, this idea of a scammer somehow identifying and intercepting a customer and then potentially tricking them into sending money. For banks listening now, how do you explain the disconnect between where a fraud or a scam, where that begins, where a scam begins and where the banks like enter? Because they're so far downstream of the of the artifice, right?
Yeah, and I think that the use of the word downstream is really important here. I think that that's kind of helpful for thinking about where in the stream process they are for frauds versus scams.
Sure.
Is that banks are one of like the last lines in the scam example,
Right.
and
like the customer is going to been convinced and they're going to send the money, and then the bank is just kind of the intermediary.
It is saying like, "Are you sure?
Yeah.
Are you really sure?" And we've seen examples in the news that there are many. I mean, it's horrible, but there are instances where if a customer is told no, they'll just keep shopping around until they eventually like are able to get it through. Right. So I think that that's why, at least on the bank side, at that point, what they can do is education and some smart friction there of saying like, "Hey, like scams do exist. Are you sure this is not it?"
Yeah.
In terms of how to better mitigate scam activity, to your point, I think it has to be further upstream where it's originating.
Yeah.
So, for example, let's take texting, a fake text that you get from the DMV.
Yeah.
If you take your phone right now and swipe, you go to hit delete, report is junk. It doesn't say report as fraud. It doesn't say report as scam.
Yeah.
So, on the back end of the telecommunications industry, as far as they've seen, are you just saying that you don't want to get text from this number? They're not hearing from you. This is a criminal activity.
Yeah.
Likewise, when you go on social media platform, you can flag accounts, but there's no like, this is a fraud and scam. This has to be taken down. There's no obligation for them to eventually do that. Mm-hmm. And you see that, as was reported relatively recently, is that for one large social media platform, they were making tons on the advertising revenue from
this is good business,
And that's a bit of a problem when you think about the incentives.
For other people, it's a problem, but yes. Yeah, I totally agree with you. But it's crazy because you're like, oh, I see why. Like, it's not a problem for you. You're so upstream of it, you're actually making money from it. No one is stealing. No one has their money at the social media platform. So the social media platform has almost no losses, right?
Yes. And they also don't have the same, sort of coercive, sounds sinister, but, obligations. There's no skin in the game for social media than there are for banks who have that customer relationship. And customers certainly is going to experience real loss and hardship because of this.
Well, and in your example too, if I encounter a scammer on a social media platform and the scammer tricks me into sending money, I probably don't actually blame the social media platform.
Yeah, who are you going to That's not like Ghostbusters.
Right?
Like, who are you going to call?
I would probably be like, my bank. I'm going to ask my bank to help me get the money back, not the social media platform, right? I have conceptualized the role of those two enterprises differently, and who can help me in this one, or who's supposed to help me in this one, and who kind of facilitated and enabled some of me being seen as or perceived as a target.
And even in your example, I think that highlights why, because I think sometimes folks say customer education, what's that going to do? You can't educate your way out of crime. But, even if you just know, or people have that change understanding of, I know bank does this, social media does this is where this activity will happen. That in and of itself would be a huge step in trying to minimize the success rate of fraud and scams.
Sure. So, we've kind of bounced around this, but in this like upstream downstream example, how does liability shift at different points in this cycle? And is there any liability for if I'm like tricked into sending my money to someone? Is there any recourse? Is there any sort of like laws that kind of protect me? Did anyone have a duty to help me or duty to warn? And did I have to fully like waive my rights in order to do these transactions?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think the most helpful framework. So I'm a lawyer and I always think about things with liability in terms of where's the harm happening.
Okay.
And so you'll see under FTA and it's implementing regulation E kind of follows that same principle.
Okay.
So in the example of someone gaining access to the consumer's account, assuming that the consumer actually does notify their institution saying, hey, this happened, there are liability caps. So
This is a
essentially,
fraud.
yes, the fraud
Okay.
example.
Yeah.
So think if someone comes up to you, robs you, takes your debit card, runs down the street, and drains your account. The customer has protections there if, once again, assuming that they actually report it and everything.
Yeah.
And that makes sense to go back to the earlier point you made, is that that's the crime's happening at the bank. It is the bank that is being deceived by fraudster. The other example, though, is that typically there are not the same kind of liability protections in the example of the scam. So that is when you are sending money to Keanu Reeves, precisely because the bank doesn't have insight to know that deception is occurring, right? Your institution doesn't, see your social media messages. They don't see your text. They have no actual visibility into that issue. And how can you stop an issue that you have visibility into? And so that's why conceptually it doesn't make sense for liability to be on the bank in the scam example. Now, the pickup here is that, as you allude to, social media doesn't really have the liability either, or telecommunications. And I think that's why when you look at other jurisdictions or various legislative proposals, a lot of them have some sort of flavor of dealing with liability and having it beyond just banking. As to whether those are super successful or have panned out or would even be a possibility here in the United States, I think is a separate question.
Sure. Okay, so before we move on to some of the more policy work, one thing that we haven't talked about, we are imagining like social media enabled digital payment scams. Like the payment itself is probably done digitally, and yet one of the biggest vectors of fraud is checks, and somewhat surprisingly, because I have personally received, I counted like 15 checks last year, but I wrote 0 checks. And, I think for many people, checks are not part of their normal payment activity. And so it has been somewhat surprising to see that it's a giant fraud vector and creating a lot of problems. And so it feels like we have to talk about checks if we're going to talk about
Let's talk about
fraud. My first question is like, what the hell? And why are checks such a pernicious fraud vector? And why are we still using them if they are so extremely insecure as a payment mechanism?
So I think that there are a few things to unpack here. First is that, as you say, checks usage, I think, is generally declining, but there's still a large part of the population that loves their check. My mother, for example, when I've talked to her about this, speaking, sitting there at Thanksgiving, and I said, oh, they're probably going to want to phase out checks. And her verbatim response was, well, at least I'll probably be dead by the time that happens, so I don't have to worry about it.
Mom, get with it.
My mother's 60. She's not.
Is she putting them in the mail or is she handing them to people?
I have really told her to not put them in the mail. But as to whether she listens to me, I think is another question.
Okay.
So there is a segment population that does want checks. There's also the fact that checks have different use cases. So traditionally, people view checks as like a big life purchase item. So it's instead of, to go, as I mentioned, we bought a house. Your painter, okay, you could pay him with, some populations want to pay him with check. Others want to pay with Zelle, for example. But, people still think of checks as filling that need.
Yeah, that's like a payment type or a transaction that would be a appropriate check one.
Yes, or, as some people say, it's like, it's a big boy purchase. It's an adult, it's one of the adult things I'm using a check for. But as you mentioned, checks have a lot of vulnerabilities with them. The mail one, great example, as you saw in the news last year about, mail carriers being essentially held up and people taking the checks and washing them. And when you look at a check, your information's all...
It's all right there.
You can, is a very well-designed vehicle for someone to engage in fraud with.
Right.
And I think the issue, though, is people agree that checks should be phased out ideally.
Yes.
But there's no sort of, when the pedal is to the metal, there's still that resistance. And it's actually the time and the infrastructure to replace it. Because then what do you replace it with, right? Like, you're gonna teach my mom how to use all the.
Your mom has to learn how to use it. Like, you're like
my mother still calls it Zelly. I was talking to the folks earlier. It's like, Mom, it's Zell.
Yeah. I think the other thing too, and like, I don't want to get bogged down on checks. I feel like it is kind of crazy because I think banks have really care about fraud in part because of the check fraud element. Because, and what I've heard is there's a lot of rules around the liability and like how you get the losses. And so this is like something where they feel like they are bearing losses in a way that with some of the other things we were talking about, fraud and scams.
And the research checks are so old.
Right.
They were written at a time where soon that the check was landing, we were looking at it and saying, is this legitimate? Okay. But in a day and age where funds have to be made available in a certain time and checks are sent digitally so much, the rules haven't necessarily been updated and modernized to introduce a little bit of what I would call some necessary friction to actually catch and identify the fraud.
Yeah. Well, okay. So one of the policies CBA has argued for is advocated for is safe harbors that would let banks share fraud data with each other without the legal exposure. Why is a safe harbor important in this situation? Why doesn't it exist today? And what impact has it had that we don't have a safe harbor and that banks can't share this information without it?
Sure. And I think implicit in your question is, why is information sharing?
Yes. Right. Yeah.
And so part of it is that it helps people identify fraud and a scam in the moment. So much of in other examples when you look at in the law, such as like PSA, money laundering concerns, that's happening after the fact. You're looking back and saying, was something fishy here?
Okay.
That's not really helpful when you want to prevent a fraud or a scam. Okay. So sharing information, sort of modeled by what our committee does, of saying, we're seeing this. Are you seeing this? You were hit by that 2 months ago. Okay, I know that. That's something that's really helpful. If you know a fraudster or a scammer is doing a certain activity, that will really help you in identifying that that's happening. But the problem is that so much of this information is very sensitive, right? It's about our financial lives.
Yes.
And that's something that is very protected under various legal regimes. And if you're a bank, you certainly want to protect your consumer, but you then don't want to get in trouble and face, significant, impositions by the government coming in later and saying, oh, you shouldn't have been able to disclose that. You shouldn't have done that. It's a real tension there of saying that you would impermissibly share this data.
It's like you thought something was shady enough that and again, I don't want to call it a crime because there's a very specific legal mechanism by which actions are declared to be criminal. But it's definitely something bothered you enough and you just want to help someone else. Either there was a transaction type or I don't know, is one of the things you could share hey, this account received money from someone else that we're not sure.
Exactly. And that kind of concern is why I think it's helpful that there just be clarity on what can be shared. And the lawyer asking for more clarity. I know real groundbreaking stuff here, but I think that's important is that if institutions know, here's the things that I can share, then they're more likely to do that. But if you're in a risk-averse environment and there's a question about it, if I worked at an institution, I'd be worried about sharing something that I did not have clear, explicit statement that I can share this information for this really good for the earth purpose.
Well, and the other thing too is to understand that information asymmetry and information silos really hurts consumers. It really hurts the banks. And I'm sure the fraudsters, they might want to share information among themselves about, maybe specific populations or numbers at work or whatever, right? The one group has an information sharing ecosystem and doesn't care about the sensitivity of the information.
Exactly.
And the other group deeply cares about the sensitivity of the information. And so we don't have the information sharing. It's like you're fighting with one hand behind your back.
And the information sharing too shouldn't just be in the bank space, right? You should have these telephone numbers are being spoofed to engage in fraud, or these accounts are saying that the same car is available for sale on a marketplace in 50 different states.
Right. Okay. So outside of the information sharing, CBA has advocated for a centralized fraud data repository. I've seen bankers ask federal banking agencies for something similar. Maybe not the exact same thing, but I've literally like seen community banks submit comment letters that are like, "Hey, could we do FFIC maintain this information? We submit to it and we gather information from it, almost like if FinCEN was a consortium and not a repository of your SARs." And
Well,
so,
I mean, even SARS themselves,
right.
some folks were discussing here yesterday about SARS once again are after the fact not super helpful for identify it. Should there be a separate fraud scam
Yeah.
reporting mechanism that has all like the actionable information
Yes.
rather than a more narrative based description of the issue?
Yes, yes. So, what's the biggest obstacle to the government, and I'll put that in quotes, operating a fraud repository? Are the private market solutions that we've seen, these like fraud consortiums, maybe using different transaction data, insufficient? And I've always asked, like, isn't the correct amount of fraud consortiums one? Like, don't we need one fraud consortium, not a bunch of fraud consortiums?
So a lot of questions to unpack there.
Yeah.
I think at a sort of threshold level of what are the hiccups for any repository
Yeah. Okay.
is that one, that's really valuable information. You want to make sure that you're putting it somewhere really safe.
Sure.
Right. But, these repositories could become targets for increased data breaches. So you want to make sure that it actually has the structure and the security needed for sharing this information. There's also what I call the buy-in problem is, you can report it, but if it's voluntary, you don't have everyone in the ecosystem.
Sure. Yes.
But if it's mandatory, then that might lead to other issues about how information is presented.
Okay.
Are people describing it the same way? Is it showing up as, someone classifies the same kind of activity in one way here, but a different way here, so it shows up as distinct activity?
Yeah.
So there needs to be, I'd say, like a common taxonomy for all of this work. As to the government, public, private question, I think one of the reasons a government one is appealing is because they could pull in more information beyond just a specific sector or an industry. And this is the ambiguous, the government.
Yeah.
But think about how helpful information is from the banking perspective. But if you could combine that with information from telco and social media to have this holistic view of the life cycle of fraud and scam activity, that would be really helpful for the government for them actually going after these actors and preventing this from happening.
It's funny. I think one reason why we can talk about this in the banking space and it's a little bit easier to imagine it relative to, we keep mentioning social media. And this comes up with my fintech friends all the time. There is a clear bank regulator. There are clear chartering agencies. There is a clear regulatory structure. And telcos ostensibly have a regulator, and they might not have the same type of regulatory frameworks that the banks have. Certainly, they don't have an insurance agency. And then social media, like, as far as I can tell, has nothing. So when we think about a consortium that would take in all this data, it's pretty easy to mandate banks do things relative to social media companies doing things, just because we have the clear regulatory framework, we have the agencies. Banks are kind of used to
Well, they have the muscle. Like they're used to, I need to report information to.
I might not like it, but if because I'm clearly regulated and supervised, and there's these enforcement mechanisms, we can have these things like a consortium. If we wanted to, we could make it mandatory. We have a long history of doing that for other areas, but in other areas like social media, there isn't that type of regulatory framework that makes things compulsive, right?
Right. And the way that some other jurisdictions have dealt this problem is going with a shared liability, like duty of care.
Oh, yeah.
But
split the losses.
But that's also a very squishy idea.
Sure.
And, granted, also in those jurisdictions, it looks very different. And, US has a lot of banks. Australia, the UK, they have a little bit less.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at the actors that are at play here, social media is, I guess we'll see how it works out in those jurisdictions, but as you allude to, they don't have the same coercive aspect to actually buy in and help fix this problem.
Look, I I can't imagine it's worse. You know what I mean? I can't and I have some questions about that. If nothing changes, if nothing changes today, what does the future look like? And is it just getting worse and worse and worse? And you can't trust any text messages that come into any unidentified, right?
I mean, when was the last time you answered a call from a number you don't know?
Well, and the worst part is when you're a journalist,
you get a lot of calls.
So a lot of it gets screened. And so a couple of times I've been like, I think someone from the city would call me randomly. Especially when you're interviewing people who are older than you and you're like, oh, you probably like a phone call and not a video call. So AI is the topic du jour of CBA. And I constantly hear AI tools for fraud purposes. Now, one reason why I think maybe AI tools have not been adopted as readily or as quickly is concern that banks might run afoul of regulators, or it's sensitive information, right? So you want to make sure you're doing it correctly. What can regulators do to give banks flexibility to deploy AI tools quickly for these fraud applications while meeting supervisor expectations? What have you guys seen or heard that's working right now?
What I think is most helpful is having a suite of options for banks to know I can employ these tools. Okay. This activity is okay.
Yeah.
And, as to go back to the top of our conversation, a lot of these AI tools are going to be in the fraud example of confirming, is this actually Kiah trying to send this money? Is this you accessing your account? And we're seeing a lot of investment there.
Okay.
I think the issue, though, is banks want to make sure they're investing in something that is permissible at the end of the day.
Yes.
And so I think greater clarity on that. Greater clarity is always...
it's like the third time you've said it in this interview.
It's really the lawyer in me. Is that I just want clear rules of the road, and then we adhere to that. But it's so important when you're dealing with scammers and fraudsters that are using wildly increasingly sophisticated methods, is that industry is doing its best to catch up. But once they do, they get a bigger AI, so we need to advance our AI capabilities. They change, we change, and having the flexibility to actually make these meaningful changes to deal with all these unique use cases that come up for new fraud and scam activity is really important.
And then what is separating the banks that deploy AI effectively versus banks where they're a little bit behind on the adoption? Do you have any sense of what the results are, or has anyone actually managed to decrease the amount of money lost to fraud and scams, or had better results from using these tools?
I think unfortunately at the end of the day, it is a resource issue. Is that AI is a large suite of tools. You need to have people. One, you need to have AI programs that actually do what they are supposed to do. And then you need the people who know how to use them in the most effective, efficient way so you can catch the bad guys. And, some institutions are heavily invested in that, but just from a pure resource management perspective, not every institution has the same amount of resources. So I think we've seen that asymmetry come up, but as tools get better, hopefully more common, all institutions should be able to eventually get on the bandwagon here and implement these AI tools to prevent fraud and scam activity.
Yeah. And going back to my thing about check fraud, I actually sometimes wonder about banks investing in tools to prevent check fraud versus getting rid of checks. Those are actually kind of two different decisions. Do I invest in a system of that would make it harder for a payment type that is vulnerable, and I'm trying to lessen that? Or am I thinking about this question, the problem the wrong way? How do I get my consumers to move away? Or how do I better understand why do they use checks? And how can I help them? How can I help with whatever a check does for them mentally? How can
you can get my mom on the podcast?
Yes, I'm going to ask her, and then I'm going to tell her how to use Zelle. But then I'm going to then the next problem is obviously being okay, but don't just send Zelle's money to anyone, right? That's the other thing, right?
You have to click through.
Now we have to click.
I have to do this. I'm saying this is okay.
Right. The fraudsters realized what the weakness was in Zelle, and they were the irrevocability of the payment. Love that.
And that's you see at the bottom of it, the big disclaimer of this money is leaving.
Yes.
Do not pass go. Do not click $200 unless you are sure of what you're doing.
Right. And I mean, and it's funny too, because Zelle, I think a lot of people like Zelle now, because they bank at a bank where it was very easy to use. And then Zelle added like the scariest language. And it's like, no, this is just a tip I want to give someone who like cut my hair or did my nails.
But sometimes scary language is important. I like the idea of calling it smart friction, because the point is, like, you don't want to make it so hard the person says, I'm not doing this, but you want the person to take a breath and think.
Right.
And that's helpful.
Slow it down.
And to your prior statement about checks, can I just say all the above is the correct answer? Like, you should look at how to make them safer. We should look at transition to other better, faster, more secure payment methods. And we should understand what is it about checks that speak to people that really love their checks.
Brian, when I was reading the check RFI that regulators came out with, someone submitted a comment letter that was like, we need to change the paper that checks are imprinted on, so that if it's washed, the paper will dissolve. And I was like, we don't live in a world where anyone is investing in the technology of the paper that checks use. I like where your head's at. I like the Swiss cheese idea.
It's a little James Bond-ish. Like, paper will explode in 10 seconds.
And like, this would have been really useful like 70 years ago. This was like a really great, the check washing, but like, no one's going to do this because that's just not the area of investment we have.
I applaud someone being invested and wanting to think creatively with solutions.
Right. Your head's in the right place. Stop using checks. I don't know what to tell you. Okay, so if nothing happens after this conversation, if we have this whole conversation and then don't change anyone's heart and mind, what does the next 12 months look like from a fraud and scam perspective for banks and consumers?
So I would say, and I am very hopeful that something will happen, but if nothing happens, then I think we're going to see things progress the way that they have. Fraudsters and scammers will find new, increasingly advanced tools.
Yeah.
Banks will do everything that they can, but they can only control what they can control, what's in their world, and ultimately will result in consumers getting hurt. But between action we've seen in Congress, there seems to be a real appetite for dealing with the fraud and scam issue.
Okay.
We've seen this flagged by administration with various task force or executive orders. That I think it's, to go back to the earlier point I made, is that the conversation has changed, which I think is so important. It's not, everyone knows this is a problem. And while people have different ideas about the best way to deal with it, it's at least helpful that we don't have to overcome making people care about it.
Right. We're kind of past the issue of like, this is a problem. We can all agree on that it's a problem. The question is like, how many different ways can we solve this problem, and who can we get on board easily? And then kind of what are some pernicious issues like the data repository sharing, right? So there's a lot of other issues that need to get addressed before we can have that very powerful digital solution, right?
And it's helpful that I think fraud scams are one of the rare issues where a lot of people are on we're playing for the same team here. Everyone wants to stop this from happening, and everyone wants to work together on it. Different industries that have different ideas of what working together looks like.
So you said you're hopeful. I'm a little bit less hopeful.
Skeptic.
You know what? But I feel like it's if we're gonna make a bet, the amount of fraud and scams that happen next year is like more likely to increase than decrease, right? That's just kind of the direction.
Realistically, probably. But
so no matter whether we all agree it's a problem, the solution remains far, in my opinion. But if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing that could alter this outcome that I just shared, the amount will increase, the dollar amount will increase, what would that thing be and why?
So in my mind, the biggest immediate issue is the lack of skin in the game for those more upstream in it.
Sure.
So I think that if I had a magic wand, I would really love to see social media have obligations to take down reported fraudulent scam profiles, offerings, etc. Kind of try and get to the source of the problem.
Yeah.
Because in my mind, a lot of the conversation sometimes talks about the back end. A bad thing has happened. What are we going to do?
Yeah.
And I'd like to stop bad things from happening instead of dealing with the fallout from them.
I'd like the social media companies to have any accountability for any of the harms that they've brought to society.
That would be helpful.
So we can start with fraud and scams. for sure.
Perfect.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining me. And I hope you have a
Thank you so
great
much
rest
for
of your
having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Bank Nerd Corner. Stay up to date with news and trends in the bank space by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. Also, if you love FinTech Takes Banking, please tell a friend. Talk to you next time.